What is going on, Sharp Football family? It is your resident Swami of Konami, Rich Hribar, and I am here post NFL schedule release with my guy Tod Burros, Mr. Best Ball NFL himself. We're going to be kind of breaking down just some of our initial thoughts kind of after the schedule kind of came out. We now know everyone's bye weeks. I still think it's an outright attack by the NFL to put Lamar Jackson, Jayden Daniels, and Anthony Richardson all on bye. That's an attack on my personal brand, but we'll work through it. I know Todd has some takes on that. As a reminder, before we jump into this, you can definitely head over to sharpfootballanalysis.com. You can use the promo code SAVE5 for the 2024 preview book written by Warren Sharp, myself, Raymond Summerlin, Ryan McChrystal, all the guys at the team. You can also use that promo code and use it for the NFL Draft Kit, which myself, Raymond Summerlin, and Tod Burros are fleshing out right now with a plethora of digestible data. I just put out my quarterback rankings with a little bit of added context on the site, so you can check those out. That article is free on the site. If you like it, you can check out the other stuff in the draft guide. With that housekeeping out of that way, Todd, we've got the schedule in the books now. We know the bye weeks. More importantly, those big money weeks, week 16, week 17. We know the matchups now. What were some of kind of your first thoughts? And let us know too, like on each site where it matters most. Kind of where these matchups align.
Well, the general thought has come along, right, to where week 17 is now just accepted as a great tiebreaker by pretty much everyone who's smart, right? And then when it gets into, well, how much should I give up to get the correlation? There's still a little bit of an argument, but we've come a long way. But then this year, Underdog threw us a bone, and they also threw us something else to consider by making the payouts flatter, which I am tremendously thankful for. You can, if you do 150 teams, you can ensure you're profitable by getting one team to the finals. And the reason is the minimum prize will max you out, right? So if you play 150 teams and you get to the finals and you have the worst team that last week, you break even for all 150 teams just off of that one entry. And you're obviously out of 150 entries going to make more money somewhere. So you're going to be profitable. So it becomes a real question. And most smart guys I've seen on Twitter seem to get the importance of week 16 as well now. And I think that there are different strategies and ways that you can build. But again, for me, for the most part, they're tiebreakers. If I'm and later in drafts, I'm much more willing to drop a round or two to find a correlation, especially this early, because a lot of those ADPs are going to change as we get closer to the season, especially on rookies and guys you think have potential. So I am much more interested in week 16 than I had been in the past, while not neglecting my week 17. And that's my thought on Underdog. And then you have to remember that you're going to get all this week 16, week 17 talk, but on a site like FFPC, week 16 has very little value because you get a 12-person pod and 3 of the 12 advance in the semifinals. So, why are you going to? So I'm much less likely to correlate on the FFPC. So it comes back to something you and I have preached since we've been in fantasy, doing this kind of work, telling people thoughts, and that is know your contest first and foremost. It is always the first thing you should do, and then build your strategies from there.
Yeah, speaking FFPC, which has that, we kind of talked about a little bit before the show, that has that, the condensed regular season before you get into the tournament play and some of their larger tournaments. And we're getting now a 6-team bye in week 14 now in FFPC with like some haymaker guys off the board too in that week 14, which is kind of a bummer, for the way that kind of plays out. I wonder if we'll see some of that change. Maybe we get that 18-week schedule if Roger pushes it through. We'll see some things kind of change in that. I do kind of want to talk about like something you hit on about week 16 now in unison from an underdog stance. being something we can pair together. So how far is too far now when you're trying to build these stacks of teams? Because, you look at some of these, like, say, let's use the Atlanta Falcons for an example, right? A team that is pretty easy to stack without reaching on ADP. They are one of the teams that ended up with a favorable end of season schedule. The final 3 weeks of the season, they play Las Vegas, the Giants, the Commanders. So when you're looking at something like just using them as an example, how far are you willing to go with a stack? Are you willing to say, what if Drake London has a great week 16, but doesn't have a good week 17? That's a Kyle Pitts week. Are you looking to now add to your stacks on more on underdog than you typically would because those 2 weeks kind of working as like a sandwich?
All right. That's a great question. So in general, it is negative EV to take the first two options in a passing game along with the quarterback. History has shown that it is less than ideal. Now, does that mean you never do it? No. So it comes down to how much does it cost, right? So if I take Drake London, who's in the second round now, Pitts is, because Cousins is so cheap, I might be willing to do a couple with Pitts, 6th, 7th round, and then you get Cousins in the 12th. The three of them are priced not too bad. But on teams where you have guys like, let's see, who's an early, like CJ Stroud with, I'm only going to take one of his options. I'm not going to burn a second, a third, and a 5th round pick to get that stack. I would rather just, when I do it, have two of the three and maybe come back with a Dalton Schultz late, or, in case of an injury, you might take someone like that backup tight end Stover. But what I am more interested in when it's not too expensive is to take like a running back with the quarterback and a wide receiver. Again, the value will change it, but to your point, if a running back goes nuts in week, like if Christian McCaffrey, I built a team recently with Christian McCaffrey, George Kittle, and Brock Purdy. Now, I'm not going to go Debo, McCaffrey, Purdy, but Kittle's 5th, 6th, 7th round, right? So it is very possible that Christian McCaffrey goes absolutely nuts in week 16. Out of the 530 teams, you might have 40% Christian McCaffrey in the finals. But of those teams, how many of them are going to have Kittle and Purdy? Probably very, very few. So I am looking at that strategy, but I'm looking at it from an overall, how much does it cost for me to get it? And how can I be unique? Because if you take two early guys, you're basically saying one of them is going to suck either week 16 or week 17, most likely. And in that case, I feel like I can get someone better who might give me 35 points along with my stack. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and a guy like McCaffrey in those 49er stacks, you get the double dip because of he could catch touchdowns as well, and you could double dip that quarterback stack.
That's another factor.
And that could be a guy like Bijan Robinson that we would even factor into that. When I led in with the Falcons, like you could do a Bijan, and maybe get Cousins and Pitts, or come back with like a Mooney late, or Rondon or whatever. You know what I'm saying? And get an opportunity like that, especially when you have one of those receiving backs. But I love the idea of doing running backs with wide receivers and stacks like that. There are a couple of things like the 49ers in general, the way the schedule shook out. I mean, week 16, they play at the Miami Dolphins, and they play at home against the Detroit Lions. They just played a really fun playoff game. We know the Lions always punch up against competition. They are a team that stands out. But like when you look at like a team that I mentioned, like the Miami Dolphins, how much are you scared now looking at this Miami Dolphins layout? Weeks 15, 16, 17, they play the Texans, the 49ers, and the Browns. This is a team under Mike McDaniel, 17-4 against non-playoff teams. They average 30 points per game, 277 passing yards per game against those opponents. Against playoff teams under Mike McDaniel, they're 3-12, averaging 20 points per game. Tua has thrown more than 2 touchdown passes in just one of those games. Like, we know that this is a team that has shootout potential. They have pieces that would fit those stacks that we talked about. But are you nervous at all about any of that stuff? Like, for them potentially bottoming out, like at the end of the season, kind of like they did the Gamers this year?
Not really. And maybe I should a little more than I am, but think of it this way. Teams can't do certain things until they can, right? We've seen it like back in the day. I'm old enough to remember when Michael Jordan couldn't win a championship because of the Celtics and because of the
we are that old, the Pistons,
right? So teams mature together and they grow. The problem with the Dolphins, though, is that they can't compete on the offensive line and the defensive line. And that's why better teams gave them so much trouble. So I'm willing to leave it up to the possibility. They were very hurt on defense down the stretch last year. And if the offensive line improves, I think they can compete against these better teams. So just because I'm not going to pass on one of the most explosive teams just over their schedule, especially when week 16, that Niners game at home, and we also saw them play much better at home than on the road. That Cleveland game is disconcerting, but we've seen Cleveland, that good defense, get beat up by good offenses. So I'm not going to overdo that. But the one thing that you said that is most important is when you look at week 16 and week 17, there's a lot of nice setups, but there is only one great setup, and that is the San Francisco 49ers playing two teams that can really keep up with them and push them to and the Niners could be the team you need in both of those weeks.
And the 49ers in general are not a team that you have to go out of your way to necessarily stack for as good of an offense as they are. Now, granted, you have to have one of the top spots to land Christian McCaffrey on your team, but the rest of the pieces kind of all do fall in sync. I have found myself, when I've gotten Christian McCaffrey at the first pick, that I generally have the opportunity to take one of the wide receivers if I want, and I don't. Purdy is just in a very palatable, the price point from off the year he had. We know he has a high ceiling, and Kittle, like you said, has been on the cheaper version of what Kittle's been over the course of his career. You can also come back easily if you don't have Christian McCaffrey, since you already don't have Christian McCaffrey on your roster, and bet against him with one of the other running backs if you're, playing the 0 RB game. I do think that that's something we'll talk about in a minute, like, the team construction, but I do want to talk about some of these other teams. With
one thing I do like to do, and it, I think we touched on it in the last show. If I don't get McCaffrey, but if I get the second, third, or fourth pick, I'm very likely to want Elijah Mitchell as my last running back. Right? Because then what you're doing is, if McCaffrey gets hurt and Elijah Mitchell ends up being the lead guy, which I think he will, I think this Guarendo kid is really raw. I don't see him as I didn't like his tape as he had the speed, but I didn't like his tape. So I'm going to bet on Elijah Mitchell. So if you end up with Tyreek Hill, a healthy Tyreek, a healthy Lamb, a healthy Chase, and McCaffrey gets hurt, and you now have Elijah Mitchell, you're almost doubling down. You know how they say draft like you're right? If you're drafting second, you act like you had the first pick and you just took one of those guys, and then you come back with Elijah Mitchell, and vice versa. If I have Tyreek, if I don't get Tyreek, if I have Lamb, I might take Waddle in the third. Because if one of the who's gonna take advantage if that first round pick gets hurt, and I like pairing them because you can get really good advance rates if you can get that kind of situation historically.
Yeah, I love that. I love getting those running backs, those elite handcuffs when I get frozen out on those rosters because it's like you're double dipping as a bet against them. What couple of these teams that I want to talk about that maybe have these potentially good layouts, and obviously this stuff is all very fluid. The NFL is fluid. We're looking at things that are going to change on the fly during the NFL season. But when we are drafting these teams, we are kind of highlighting some or our projections on some of these teams, what we believe that they're gonna. We know the rosters right now. We know kind of what we think that the upside for some of these teams are. One thing that stands out to me, I think, based on the schedule, especially the end of the season schedule, is the AFC South. The AFC South teams all kind of have these really kind of like good layouts. They face each other. These are teams that are vulnerable. And I think that are largely teams that are undervalued. The first team I want to talk about is the Tennessee Titans. Basically, almost everyone on their roster is palatable. I think Tony Pollard's maybe a little overpriced, which is ironic coming from me last year. But I look at their roster right now and the potential changes that they've had, with what they have, losing Derrick Henry, losing Mike Vrabel, getting Brian Callahan and, the Callahans together, what he could do, what the dad could do for the offensive line, obviously what we've seen, Bob do, and of course for his career. But this is a team that's going to run a lot of 11 personnel. They've already signaled it to us. They go out and they get Calvin Ridley. They get Tony Pollard to be interchangeable with Tajay Spears. So both of these guys can operate in unison with an offense, unlike Derrick Henry and Tajay Spears did last year. They still have DeAndre Hopkins. They go get Tyler Boyd, who worked with Callahan in Cincinnati. I mean, this is a team that stands out to me. You have a wild card in Will Levis. Like, is Will Levis probably bad? Probably, but what if he's not? Well, this is a team. I think the Tennessee Titans just stand out to me with a really good layout, and they've got these teams that we're inherently looking at the schedules, and we want to already stack those teams against them. So why are we not taking them along for the ride?
I did a show with my friend Mark Garcia, Hilo, about a week ago, and he also got me on the Titans, and now you liking them. I'm coming around. So one of the things I mentioned to Hilo on that show is human nature really struggles to get the depth of the meaning of certain things, right? Mike Vrabel leaving, right? And I do it, and I know better. I see Tennessee players, and my initial reaction, because he was there for 5-6 years, is even as I was going through the schedule, is that's not a good matchup because they play slow. And then I'm like, wait a second. And it's the same thing with Arthur Smith leaving Atlanta. I taking a ton of Bijan Robinson because he was grossly underused last year, right? So I'm with you on the Titans. I'm coming around. Tajay Spears. I feel that people are way too confident that Pollard is going to be the 1A and Spears is going to be the 1B. I think that Spears is a hyper talented guy, and they're gonna want to put up points. It's not your dad's Titans. So I'm with you on it, Rich.
Yeah. And like I said, they're already facing teams that, when we look, for the fantasy playoffs, and we're already trying to stack those teams already. Like we've talked about the Colts. We talked about them when we did the show a couple weeks ago, and some of the pieces that we liked on that roster. And then, the Jaguars are another team. When you look at the Jaguars, they're a team that's not that difficult to add to your roster either. Like we'll talk about this, the way the running backs have dipped, but I mean, Travis Etienne
is also one other thing.
What's that?
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, go for it.
What do all four of those teams have in common? And it's a slight upgrade, but all four of them are warm weather cities, right?
Yeah,
16 and 17. We know that there's going to be a few very likely between those 2 weeks. We're going to have 2 or 3 games each of those weeks that are suboptimal weather-wise. And you see all the geniuses on Twitter talking about dome games. And I'm not against dome games, but warm weather is almost as good as a dome, right?
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
when I am big on little subtle advantages that most people aren't calculating in. And all four of these teams play in warm weathers.
Yeah, I mean, we might get some. Sometimes Tennessee throws that weird curveball at us, where you're like, "Why is the ground frozen in Tennessee?"
Yeah.
But yeah, I just think that the AFC South stands out to me as a division that, like, I'll probably be trying to get a lot of those correlated stacks because I think that a lot of the guys on those rosters are largely affordable without having to go out of your way, especially when you look at the Jaguars wide receivers. Ingram might be a little overpriced, especially on a site like Underdog that's not full point PPR. But Travis Etienne, the running backs continue to go at a later and later rate, which we're, like I said, hinted at, we're going to get into a little bit later.
NFC South too.
Yeah, and I was going to say that was going to be the other division I was going to bring up was the NFC South, and they're kind of like these on the surface, like, well, they're crummy divisions. Like, I'm not that excited about them, but like, yeah, we brought up the Falcons. The Saints are another team too that like no one's really talking about the coaching changes with the Saints either.
I was just going to say, yep.
Clint Kubiak is going to run a different system. And they've got some pieces that in the best ball world can do some things. Obviously, you have like the wild card in Taysom Hill. But guys like Rashid Shaheed have been undervalued all offseason. A.T. Perry, and especially in this offense, that the way it wants to operate, especially when you go to A.T. Perry, what he did in college and what he did the first year in the NFL, this guy's a touchdown scorer. Like he might only catch, he's not going to have many games where he catches more than 3 or 4 passes, but man, that dude's a touchdown scorer.
He's a talented guy. I liked his tape last year. And I've had trouble drafting Kamara because there's so many great running back values later. But Kendra Miller is one of my favorite targets this year. I forget if I have him right now as a target or a value. But, I mean, he was a guy whose tape I didn't like as much as some last year. But he played well last year. And, again, like you mentioned, new coaching staff, new offensive coaching staff. Michael Thomas is gone. And I mean, I'm not drafting much Derek Carr because of Taysom Hill, but Kendra Miller is a guy I think who could really be. It's one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about. If not on this show, we could do like a whole show on you and I, because again, back to human nature. What's human nature? I don't like this guy because he's blocked. Right.
Whatever, yeah.
Right. He's blocked. Like doing a show on guys who are so talented. Yes, they're blocked. And one of the hardest things to do in best ball, in my view, that's something that I wasn't good at, that I'm really trying to be better at, is having this viewpoint of, all right, forget what everything looks like now. What is it going to look like in week 16? Well, a lot of teams are eliminated in week 16. They're playing these rookies. They're giving their young guys a chance. So kind of just having that mindset of being able to see what isn't there is something I'm trying to get better at, Rich.
Yeah, and I think one of the easiest ways to do that in the best ball stance is, and it swerves right into where the public is skating right now, is if you're building these wide receiver heavy rosters, or you're getting on the log ride, and you're saying, hey, if I forego wide receivers, I'm going to be playing from behind, and you're drafting wide receiver heavy rosters in unison, and you've got to hit some of these running backs if you're going to draft that way. And I think there are some guys that now that we got the schedule release that you look at that I think are very intriguing now to add on these rosters. Especially we brought up the Falcons, like Tyler Algier is a pretty like easy guy to kind of look at. But how about some oddballs? Evan Hall for the Colts, I think that we brought up the Colts. Mm-hmm. This is a team that has a completely wide open depth chart behind Jonathan Taylor, a player that's missed time and dealt with things the last 2 years. I think Trey Benson, when you look at the Cardinals schedule and the way it shakes out, it's very backloaded where they have a lot more favorable opponents the back half of the season. We know that James Conner is probably not going to be on that roster next year. Do they extend Trey Benson as the season goes on? Is James Conner just doing his token, missing a couple of games at that point? The Chargers are a team. Kamani Vidal, I think, becomes very interesting. They have a favorable schedule. The back half, Kendra Miller was on my list because, again, the Saints, the NFC South. Those guys all, I think, when you're building your rosters this way, those are guys that I now want to target on those specific rosters now that I've seen the way the schedule's laying out, in particular when I miss out on the guys like Bijan Robinson or Jonathan Taylor.
I like mixing at least 1 or 2 of them in draft, and I'll throw out 2 more. Marshawn Lloyd was, other than Brooks, Marshawn Lloyd was my favorite tape this year for running backs. Very explosive guy. And I wasn't like in love with him, but to your James Conner point, Tyrone Tracy of the Giants, Devin Singletary. I think adding 1 to 2 of those guys per team and then hoping that your team that advances, you get that. It's like winning the bonus round if you get that guy remember Rashad Penny a couple years ago? He went absolutely nuclear.
Yep.
Who was the guy, the running back that was there, who was always getting hurt?
It was Chris Carson, right?
Yes, Chris Carson. Yeah. And so I was on Penny, but I just didn't have him on the right teams. But Chris Carson and Amon-Ra St. Brown were what really won people money a couple years ago. So, and then the next year, people were all chasing that. Now everyone's chasing Puka, but the issue is, mixing those guys in late rather than just some guy who might help you advance, I think is one of the key strategies in best ball is most important if you want to win $1 million.
So one of these teams that definitely we would have a preconceived notion coming in that we don't think is going to be good plays all these teams that we mentioned during that stretch run of weeks 15, 16,
Can I guess?
17. Yeah, go for it.
Giants?
No, but they are also one of those teams.
I mean, Daniel Jones is absolutely free, and we don't even know if he's going to be healthy, if he's going to be playing. But build a few Daniel Jones teams. You've got Neighbors, you've got Hyatt, and you've got Wandell, who are all good receivers, right? And that's what I mean about looking for things that don't seem apparent.
Yeah,
what if
Hyatt is one of my favorite?
Healthy?
Yeah, Hyatt's one of my favorite round 18 picks.
I have a lot of Wandell. I'm sorry, but what was the team that you were going to say?
Yeah, and it's going to be one of those teams that you said plays 3 dome games. And it's the Las Vegas Raiders.
Oh, yeah.
We've already established we like Devontae Adams and we think he's undervalued. We've kind of beaten this drum the entire offseason. I've said I take him at the 1-2 turn. Very often when I'm picking in that spot because I think he's better than some of those receivers that go after him. But has it changed? Has their kind of layout and building some of these teams that you maybe want to cross correlate changed your mind? Potentially anyone else like a Zamir White, a Brock Bowers, perhaps Jacoby Myers, like any of those types of guys.
Yeah, I mean Brock Bowers his ADP is still high, but as far as Jacksonville, because I take so much Devontae Adams, I've taken a few Gardner Minshew teams and a few Aiden O'Connell teams because they're just not getting drafted in every draft, right? So if you need a third quarterback, or sometimes if I get to the 18th round and I just don't have someone that I love, and I feel like the rest of my positions are like I've got 2 really good tight ends, 7, good wide receiver, I'll just throw in a third quarterback because like one of my favorite. Okay. So Denver is a team that I think people are sleeping on, and the thought again, what if Bo Nix doesn't suck? And what if Sean Payton really is a good offensive mind, because if you follow Twitter, right now, everyone is down on Sean Payton and everyone thinks Bo Nix sucks. Well, what if they don't, right? And you can get Troy Franklin late. Cortland Sutton is basically free. I mean, all these kinds of situations and mixing in is in my mind, something that I wasn't good enough at. I kind of was too old school. And if you ask me, hey, Todd, you're a boomer. What have you learned over the last couple of years? It's to be way more aggressive with young players and trying to see things that maybe, get rid of those preconceived notions of I hate that guy, he sucks.
Yeah, that's the toughest hurdle for people to say is, they'll cross guys off their list or, there's no ADP they would draft is because that's a great point you bring about Adams and the quarterback because it's a situation where those guys don't get drafted a lot because no one really believes in the other guy that, they're both will play this year at some point, both Minshew and O'Connell. But if you are a team that makes it through with Adams, just having the stacking partner is probably going to be unique outside of the teams that even have Adams, because we saw even last year, in week 17, the dude went bonkers. Like he went absolutely bonkers. and the quarterback's going to go along for the ride, where you might sneak one of those teams as being
over
unique.
the last few years, no one has had more nuclear games than Davante Adams.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I said, we don't need to harp on more. Davante Adams is undervalued.
But why not? Why not indulge ourselves? I mean,
but also if you miss out on him, maybe those are the teams you maybe add Bowers to, or you add Jacoby Myers to.
One thing we talked about last time that the field has already corrected on is Jayden Daniels' ADP.
Right.
I think he may have gone up almost 2 rounds since our last podcast. And I see him go ahead of Caleb Williams now occasionally. I miss the days of being able to get Terry McLaurin in the 7th round and come back with Jayden Daniels in the 12th.
Have you altered your approach then at Jayden Daniels? Are you just completely fine? Are you fine to roll with just the solo, isolated, naked Jayden Daniels and just take what comes in? Or
I normally stack him. He's too. If you miss on Terry McLaurin and you take Jayden Daniels, Jahan Dotson is pretty much free.
That's what I was going to ask. Are you doing any Dotson? Or are you doing even in Austin Eckler? I think.
And I've Luke McCaffrey. What if the name actually means something? Like, he's a guy that I just didn't even watch tape on, immediately poo-pooed. But you know what? We've seen these.
He's good at the game, man. Luke McCaffrey's a hashtag good at the game guy. I don't know if he'll ever be a high fantasy scorer, but he's for sure a hashtag good at the game.
You only need him to have that. That's the thing. In the 17th, 18th round, if Terry McLaurin goes down, and that's the week Luke McCaffrey catches 2 touchdowns and gets 80 yards and 6 catches, I'm not taking him a lot. But I'm saying where I would have avoided him as someone who's, what isn't going to be a high fantasy scorer, I'm much more open this year, Rich.
Yeah, one of these teams that so we've always known the opponents of these teams. We've known the kind of the strength of schedule from an opponent stance. We were just kind of looking at the layout of these games. One of these teams that I'm absolutely terrified of, and I know they're going to, by hook or crook, they're going to find a way to be floating around 500, but the Pittsburgh Steelers have an absolutely miserable run out after their week 9 bye. Like an absolutely horrendous run out towards the back half of the season. I think this is where we might see a potential quarterback flip-flop at that point in the season, where we could see some shakeup. This is already a team that I think that I'm definitely not in love with, because we brought up the Arthur Smith stuff before. But man, this team, when the way it shakes out for them the back half, they play 6 of their final 9 games against AFC North teams. And then you've got teams like the Eagles and the Chiefs mixed in there. Like, it's rough for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And this is a team I know a lot of people are giving the benefit of the doubt because of Tomlin. But man, I think this could be finally the year where the Steelers do not get that 500 record.
Well, so a lot of the cool kids are taking Justin Fields.
I don't know what we're doing with this, but
and I look, Justin Fields is a guy 2 years ago who had multiple 40-point games, right? I started mixing him in. It's really uncomfortable, because to take a backup quarterback and as I don't want to miss out on a guy that I owned a ton of last year if he goes nuclear this year and he costs round 16 or later. But is Arthur Smith and Mike Tomlin going to let him run the ball like they should? So it's more than one hurdle for Justin Fields to, a very smart guy once said to me, it doesn't matter where, as only if they can hurt you versus who else you take in that round, right? So, Justin Fields can obviously hurt you if you fade him completely, but I think that I'm still having trouble seeing the road to those nuclear games.
Yeah, same. I mean, and at this stage of their career, both of these guys are almost like the Spider-Man meme. I mean, you look at last year, Russell Wilson, he threw the ball behind the line of scrimmage, the second highest rate in the league, and then downfield at the third highest rate. We always call them the James Harden offense, like he's shooting 3-pointers or he's taking layups. But that's exactly what Justin Fields was. I mean, he was second in the NFL in deep throw rate. He was seventh in throws behind the line of scrimmage. He didn't have that. Neither of these quarterbacks have that intermediate passing game in them right now. Russ hasn't had it for a number of years. The NFL defensive game is caught up to Russell Wilson. We used to always do the narrative, let Russ cook. But no matter who the offensive coordinator's been in Russell Wilson's career, the offense ends up looking the damn same because Russell Wilson is who he is. He's a big game hunter. He wants to extend plays. He wants to push the ball down the field. When I look at this Arthur Smith offense, I don't see how either of these quarterbacks fit this, because this is an offense that wants to run a lot of play action and they want to hit those intermediate shots. This is what resurrected Ryan Tannehill's career, is he lived in that 10 to 19 yard range with the Tennessee Titans with Arthur
And
Smith.
they had a running back who you had to respect on every play, could go the distance. I'm just going to say that there's one other thing that Justin Fields and Russell Wilson have in common. And we're finally starting to get smarter of how negative it is. And that is they both take sacks at just a ridiculous. Russell Wilson, even in his best years, took sacks at a ridiculously high rate. What made Russ so amazing back when he was amazing was that when he did throw the ball, he normally threw it deep and he threw it accurately. And he also was really good with his legs in the way that coaches like quarterbacks to use their legs. When a pass play breaks down, he would find a lane and get you 10, 15 yards. Coaches like that. Coaches don't have quarterbacks who immediately give up on a play and just look to run.
Yeah, they're going to be an interesting team. And I said the schedule, just the way it shook out. We always knew their opponents, but the way it shook out, man, this is a team I think that like the back half of the year could struggle. Like again, watch the Steelers pull this, rabbit out of a hat again. This is a team that won 8 games with Duck Hodges and Mason Rudolph one year. But that's definitely one of those teams. Maybe I have to get over my mental hurdle with. So maybe I need to start drafting more.
One other thing I do want to talk about is, not all correlations are the same. Now, I know people know this, but I have very little. The worst, I think, in my few years of correlating, I can't remember a worse Week 17 game than New England and the Chargers. Right?
They played one last year that was really bad.
And now you've got Jim Harbaugh. I can't get behind Gus the Bus. Can you?
No, not really. I mean, I can see the path for him in this offense in like a best ball stance from an underdog stance, just because it's a touchdown driven site. But I would much rather just take, Kamani Vidal, like if I said later, who could be playing.
I got to watch him. I didn't even watch his tape. There's like 5-6 guys who got good landing spots that I hadn't watched that I need to watch.
Yeah, because by that point of the season, a guy like Gus Edwards on a short-term, deal on a team that's in a transition stage, like he could not be getting as many touches as we believe. At that point.
And Gus is a guy who gets dinged up.
And he's also a guy that's never had a high workload. I mean, the most touches he's had in an NFL season came last year. So, I mean, even projecting him for a high workload is still projecting a player that's compartmentalized. He's a very limited player still.
Yep.
Yeah, so I mean that kind of shakes out. Is any of these other teams, before we jump in, kind of like this to the second portion here to bring things home, stand out to you?
I think that New Orleans Las Vegas game, Week 17.
That's what I said. Yeah, New Orleans.
I think that is I think that's a really intriguing game. I think that another really, really sneaky offense could be. I might have mentioned, I forget which show I mentioned it on, but Deontay Johnson is a guy that I've never really gotten behind because I've always felt his ADP was too high. Well, now he goes, we saw how Adam Thielen just was peppered by Bryce Young last year. Now Deontay Johnson is there. Deontay Johnson is always open. Another one of these what ifs. What if Bryce Young doesn't completely suck, and Deontay Johnson is a good player, obviously, and then you come back with where did it go? With Tampa Bay, and we know that Tampa Bay had some really explosive weeks. So like a Mike Evans.
Yeah, even Godwin. Todd, I don't know if you noticed, but the field has started to talk about Chris Godwin after we talked about him 2 weeks ago too.
Yeah. And it's a shame because I really started adding him since then, and now it's starting to adjust.
But I to your point though, I think you have to take at least micro bets on the Carolina Panthers just based on where all those guys are being drafted at, and obviously Deontay has like at least a tangible ADP, but it's still relatively low based on the type of receiver
he is. FFPC, he's in the double-digit rounds right now.
And that's where you would more rather have him too, is FFPC, by the way. Like it's
right.
more driven towards where you'd want him.
Yeah.
But I mean, when you look at, and Bryce Young had a historically bad rookie season, but we have seen guys like a Matthew Stafford, a Jared Goff, a Blake Bortles, a Derek Carr have those like heinous rookie seasons and kind of have some bounce back. Like none of those guys outside of Stafford turn into like, well, I guess maybe Goff now getting the richest contract, for a quarterback, have had like great careers, but like those guys did bounce back and they were values in year two because of where the price, like people left them for dead. And also I think, you have to look at what Dave Canales did in Seattle 2 years ago with Geno Smith, what he did with Baker Mayfield last year. And you just have to say like, all right, here it is again, 3 years in a row. Can you do it for us? Can you pull like someone out of the depths of hell, of fantasy hell, and make them relevant?
I think, I watched a lot of Bryce Young last year, and when I watched, because I don't watch college football, I watched Stroud's tape and his tape, and I was just dumbfounded that people were willing to take him over CJ Stroud. And this is not, I said it all last off season. You just watch the two of them throw the ball and you're like, there's no comparison. But Bryce Young had moments last year. And then other times he looked completely clueless. And you wonder if some of that was coaching. And you wonder if some of that was his receivers other than Thielen just being.
Well, in the interior of that offensive line, there's a reason they paid all that money for those guards. And you can question whether Damian Lewis or Robert Hunt were worth the contracts that they given them. But when you're the Carolina Panthers in the spot you are with no draft equity because of that trade, I mean, you have to be aggressive in free agency. And getting those two guards, Tyler Moton is still one of the better right tackles in the league. It's remained to be seen whether Ike Ekwonu is going to live up to kind of his draft pedigree. We've seen like a guy with Evan Neal and Trevor Penning the past couple of years just never be able to get out of that box. And Ekwonu had an awful year last year. But when you look at some of the pieces on the offensive line, it is a better offensive line than where we left off a year ago because the interior was just awful.
If a rookie smaller quarterback has the middle of his line
as interior pressure, because we've seen it even with Kyler. Quarterback size is one of these things like the NFL has gotten a little more lenient on, but we have seen these smaller quarterbacks struggle in that capacity. It's been a bugaboo for Kyler. The start of his career. We talked about Russell Wilson now he's basically turned into like a check down or throw deep artist. He's not hitting the intermediate area of the field. And the Carolina Panthers, what did they have last year? I mean, they had the lowest frequency of offensive line combination in the NFL. Their most frequently used offensive line, 17% of their snaps. They used 6 different guards last year. Like no guard on their team played more than 10 games. There's a reason they paid for 2 guards. So, I mean, I think you make micro bets on the Panthers. You don't go crazy. You don't stack, Bryce Young with Deontay Johnson and Jatavian Sanders or Xavier Legette.
I love Jatavian Sanders.
But you mix in those guys, and you mix them probably in when you took a Mike Evans, when you took a Chris Godwin,
right?
When you took a Rashad White.
Jatavian Sanders you can get him as the third wide tight end. He's a very talented guy. I had him as the second best tight end coming out. I like betting on explosive players.
Especially with those late picks. We talked about Jalen Hyatt fitting that MO. Let's bring this home here. Todd does this, this article every week on the site. You can go to the Sharp Football Fantasy Guide, check this out. He's updating it regularly, where he's following ADP and ADP trends, and he's now letting you know where the market has moved. Is this guy now a value? Is he a target? Is he now a guy to be leery of? He's updated those for the post-schedule release. You can use promo code SAY5 again to check that out. We do want to talk about some of the movers there in that area. And like I said, underdog the last couple of years, the game has gotten cognizant of pushing these wide receivers up the draft board, foregoing running backs. This year's been no different the start of the year. And we've started to see even some guys that opened up with higher ADPs drop now. Kyren Williams is one of them, Devin A-Chain being the other. Kyren Williams has kind of had like a little bit like a small negative feedback loop since the draft. They draft Blake Corum. It's one of the few teams that Blake Corum could have gotten drafted to where he actually like is physically and athletically comparable to the incumbent, which not have been happened to a lot of other rosters. We've also seen the Rams be like a backfield that's had some fluidity, kind of year over year, especially since Todd Gurley's gone. And then now, we've had Sean McVay come out.
Falls in and out of love with running backs like a 16-year-old boy.
And McVay just came out and said that, Kyren Williams is not going to participate in these voluntary OTAs. Reminded, we don't need to go crazy with injuries at this point either. But, it is kind of like I said, this just like we just keep chipping away at Kyren Williams, where he opened up as being like a mid 2, then he was a late 2. Now we're seeing him get into the third round, pushing mid to third round. So, is now the time to jump in on Kyren Williams while, the market is the softest?
So, bigger picture, the running back values have continued to get better and better. So last show, you and I talked about taking one of McCaffrey, Bijan, or Breece Hall.
Yes.
Because they can give you a game that no one else could at the running back position. Well, now with Kyren and Achane both falling, it makes to me Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson and Tyreek Hill and CeeDee Lamb much more interesting. So I'm much less likely to want to push Breece or Bijan in the first, because I know I can get Kyren or Achane at the end of the second, early third. So, and then overall running back values have gotten so good that the biggest change, and I wrote about it in my article this week, is a lot of there are so many good running backs that I was, quote, targeting, which is my highest level, and value is the second level. I made a lot of the targets values because there's just so many running back values. You don't need to target any of them because you can get plenty of good values. But also, again, like I said, there is just more ways to build. Travis Etienne continues to fall. So if you don't get Kyren and you don't get one of the first round running backs, you could get Derrick Henry or Etienne end of the third, beginning of the fourth. And you could still build a good hero running back roster with any of those guys. So, Rich, my way of drafting has evolved because of the continued value of the running backs. And now I'm like, well, if I can get a Jamar Chase or a Jefferson or a Tyreek, none of these other wide receivers can catch them. So, again, it goes back to the whole thing of draft as if you're right. I might only have 8 to 10% Kyren Williams, but in those teams, I'm drafting as if he's going to be the Kyren Williams of last year. Right?
Yeah. And I think that's like you said, originally I was like, oh, Kyren Williams, I'm probably not going to be that aggressive with him at his price when we look at kind of guys that have come out of like day 2 and had these pop-off seasons in years 1 and 2. They haven't been historically great bets. I mean, when you look at guys like, Dameon Pierce a year ago, we had Phillip Lindsay, we had James Robinson, guys like, then you want to go back to like our days and we had guys like Steve Slayton and, guys, do you remember Jordan Howard, those guys and like so it's like, all right, do we kind of look at this big thing in totality? Also, other reason too, is like Kyren he's going to concede stuff to Blake Corum anyways, because it's a necessity. Kyren Williams last year had 6 games where he had over 90% of the backfield touches. That was tied with Joe Mixon for the most in the NFL. Joe Mixon played all 17 games. Kyren Williams only played 12 games. The reason Kyren Williams had the workload he had last year was because the LA Rams backup running backs were atrocious. With Kyren Williams off the field last year, they were dead last in the NFL at 3.3 yards per carry. They were 25th in EPA per rush. There's a reason they drafted Blake Corum, is because when Kyren Williams missed time last year, their depth at that position was exposed. So they were always going to add to that. So I also want to throw the baby out with the bathwater because of this Blake Corum stuff, right? Like should have always been expected that Kyren Williams is not going to need to have 90% of the backfield touches regularly in games. And if he can concede some of that and stay healthier, but still keeps his grip on the monopoly touches, he still was a guy that, remember, he was second in points per game behind Christian McCaffrey last year because he had all the elite, heavy weighted, rich and fantasy fat touches in that offense, for touchdowns. So if he can hang on to that role, then that becomes, a guy that becomes intriguing, when he falls into around pick 30 now on these teams where you already have an absolute haymaker. And even more so, to double down on what you just hit on with Devin Achane. I mean, Devin Achane is he's the kind of guy where you understand projections are never he's always going to look overvalued. But dude, there's a real FOMO with Devin Achane. When your opponent has Devin Achane, you're scared, right? When you set that lineup, you're like, shit, is this going to be the week that Devin Achane has a 60-yard touchdown run on me and I've got to try to make up some ground? And then because that team got Devin Achane now, like we said, at pick 30 or in the third round, and they've already got Jamar Chase, who happened to have one of his, 150-yard games also that week. You just can't combat that. You just can't combat those kind of crooked numbers. So Devin Achane, I get it. I get to where, like you say, from a projection-based stance, he could potentially be overvalued because we want volume. But when you look at the way the current NFL is constructed right now, it's opened the door for these guys like Devin Achane and even Jahmyr Gibbs, I will say, to have more fantasy relevancy than in years past, because we have a finite number of guys that are now getting 300 touches or play all three downs and do all these things. And it's made these guys now that are explosive, and maybe they top out at 210 to 240 touches, but they're explosive players. It's made those guys a lot more valuable for fantasy football because they hang crooked numbers up when you might have some of these guys like a Zamir White who maybe project for more volume, but if they don't score touchdowns, you're still not getting anything out of these guys. So Devin Achane's a guy I will still be willing to add to a bunch of rosters if he wants to fall, especially those teams where I get to open with a Tyreek Hill or Jamar Chase, easy button press for me.
Yeah. So I've come up with a new phrase for how I view roster building, and I call it the seesaw effect, right? We all played seesaw when we were kids, right? So a guy like Devin Achane is on one end of the seesaw. He's a heavy weight on one end of the seesaw. You don't know which week it's going to go off, but he's too good to avoid completely. So what I want to do on the other end of the seesaw in my running back room is have guys that have a little bit more of a floor, right? So I believe that each position group needs a certain amount of floor and a certain amount of ceiling. So I'm looking to, like, a Devin Singletary is a guy that I'm much more interested in an Achane lineup than I would be in a Christian McCaffrey lineup.
Correct.
Right. So, that is one of the important thoughts that I've been trying to get out this year is, don't avoid these. And I didn't draft much Achane in early best ball in the early second round. I took just enough not to hate life if he went absolutely nuclear. But now that he's in the third round, I am much more interested in him. And for the reason you said, you can have two really good floor ceiling guys in the first and second round, add his nuclear ability in the third round, and then you can mix and match your running backs to go with him to blend to give you a little bit more floor than you would on a lineup with a guy like Derrick Henry, for say.
Yep, 100%. Yeah, it's an easy way to kind of find some correlation from a roster stance. But I always tell people, especially, obviously it's, best ball is more wide open. People are open to the big scoring weeks. But I mean, high scoring weeks win you weeks in a capacity that doesn't equal the way low scoring weeks lose you weeks. Typically, if you have a bad fantasy week, it's because largely the entirety of your roster underperformed and not one player. And it's something that gamers have, and from a redraft stance, have had a really hard mental thing to get over. They always hear about, I would rather have a consistent player, but a player like Achane is always going to be more valuable, even through a sporadic moments. We've lived this life with Mike Evans basically his whole career at this point. But the high points of those players win you weeks at a larger rate than their lows lose you weeks. But the lows stand out in people's brains. But they,
and with best ball, it's more important because the floor on any given team on any given week is going to be higher because you're selecting the best score of 5 running backs, 8 wide receivers. Scoring is a lot flatter in best ball than it is in season long for that reason, right? Yes. It only makes sense. So all the more spike weeks become more important in best ball because that's what separates you from the pack, right? Those 35 to 40 point weeks are absolute gold in best ball because you could have 5, 7, 10 running backs. If Achane puts up a 40 burger, you're going to be probably 20 points behind him.
Yeah, right? And absolutely. And he, like I said, he fits in a lot of those builds that you talked about earlier with, you get a Kittle late or something too, you can stack on there too as well. All right, that's going to put a bow on this. Let's put a bow on that. If you want to read the rest of the guys that stand out for this latest round of ADP changes, especially after the schedule release and the buys came out, make sure to go to sharpfootballanalysis.com. Todd has already written up all of that with his companion piece with the actual rankings and the nice color coded chart. If you can just find things really easily. You can also, what's cool about that chart that a lot of people don't know if you're already using it, is that you can actually, there's a drop box where you can actually just highlight all the values and just pull up the values or all the targets like that. And you can look at things very simple like that. You don't even have to go through all the colors. Very handy.
The colors go really good with mushrooms.
Yeah, get a little psychedelics there, in the off season. There's nothing wrong with that. Remember, you can use promo code SAVE5 if you do head over the draft kit. I've been putting out a ton of stuff recently. I've kind of been on a big rankings run, adding some context to my rankings. We're going to have stuff popping all summer, especially after the book drops. You can always use that code too if you're not even interested in fantasy football for the 2024 preview book that Warren Sharp has come out every year. That's promo code SAVE5. Go over to sharpfootballanalysis.com. Use that. He's Todd. I'm Rich. We'll be back here shortly, probably in a couple weeks. Good luck, everybody.